Medieval battlefields were not decided by chivalrous ideals and shining armor alone. They were shaped by instruments of terrifying efficiency, each designed to exploit the enemy's vulnerabilities. Behind every victory stood not only valiant knights, but also the inventive weaponsmiths who translated human fears into lethal weaponry. The warhammer exemplifies this brutal efficiency. Knights invested heavily in plate armor, believing themselves virtually invulnerable. While superior plate armor could deflect sword blows and arrows, the warhammer rendered such protection tragically inadequate, a personal death knell. Unlike swords, which often glanced harmlessly off plate armor, the warhammer focused immense energy on a small area. A direct blow could crush a helmet and skull without even penetrating the metal. The physics were brutal but undeniably effective, as that energy had to be directed somewhere, and the knight's brain was the unfortunate target. Knights likely envisioned themselves as armored juggernauts, but instead they became, in effect, human dinner bells. Many warhammers incorporated a vicious spike on their reverse side, enhancing the weapon's versatility. The hammer face crushed, the spike pierced. Against heavily armored adversaries, all one required was the appropriate implement, a can opener for plate armor, as it were. A knight could survive a sword blow due to his armor, but the concentrated force of a warhammer's blow, transmitted through the metal, would devastate the soft tissue beneath. The horrifying sound of warhammer meeting helmet, a distinctive crunch, marked the end, frequently fatal, of a knight's military career. At the Battle of Agincourt, 1415, English soldiers used warhammers to devastating effect against French knights stuck in the mud. The once protective armor became a tomb. The warhammer's accessibility democratized warfare. Unlike swords, it needed little training, requiring only sufficient strength to wield and the will to strike. This made it attractive to ordinary soldiers who lacked extensive combat instruction. It served perhaps as history's first user-friendly weapon, though the user manual would have been disturbingly succinct. Archaeological finds reveal warhammer heads weighing up to 7 pounds, a considerable mass when swung from a 3-foot handle. The resultant momentum could easily fracture bone, even through plate armor that would have stopped a sword or arrow. Repeated impacts on some warhammers, evidenced by their worn smooth faces, speak volumes about the weapon's effectiveness. As armor technology advanced throughout the medieval period, so did warhammer design. Early versions were little more than modified tools, but later models were explicitly crafted for combat. By the 15th century, some featured armor-piercing spikes, reinforced shafts, and specialized striking surfaces designed to penetrate even the finest Milanese steel. It was a miniature arms race. Superior armor met with deadlier hammers. Knights, after years of training in the chivalric arts, were often undone by a common soldier wielding this upgraded tool. Regardless of social status or wealth, a determined opponent wielding a warhammer posed an equal threat to any skull. While the warhammer utilized brute force to overcome plate armor, other medieval weapons introduced an element of unpredictable lethality. The flail, a spiked metal ball tethered to a wooden handle by a chain, epitomizes this unpredictability. Unlike the straightforward warhammer, the flail was volatile, requiring skill and defying physics. If the warhammer was medieval problem-solving, the flail represented medieval chaos theory in action. Its basic construction was deceptively simple: a wooden handle, a chain, and a spiked metal ball. However, this simplicity belied a weapon of terrifying complexity. The chain introduced a delay between the wielder's movement and the striking head's impact, making precise timing essential for effective use. Medieval texts describe extensive training, with novices spending months mastering self-control before facing an opponent. Medieval weapons instructors likely had the easiest job interviews ever. Self-injury was exceedingly common among flail trainees. Historical records from military hospitals across Europe document numerous injuries incurred during flail training. Modern experimental archaeologists attempting to recreate flail techniques have also corroborated this. Many have experienced bruises, lacerations, and even broken bones during practice. The flail holds the singular distinction of being the only medieval weapon with a confirmed kill count against its users. Proficiency required not only strength but also keen spatial awareness and precise control over momentum. It's unlikely many trainees refrain from drawing up a will before each practice session. Given these challenges, the flail's popularity required explanation. It excelled against heavily armored late medieval opponents, The flexible chain enabled the striking head to bypass shields and other defenses that thwarted rigid weapons like swords or maces. Even a well-placed shield could result in the spiked ball wrapping around its edge to strike the defender. This unpredictability was particularly effective against defensively minded fighters who relied on precise blocking techniques. The flail's physics also amplified its impact. The chain acted as a force multiplier, creating a whip-like effect. Tests show a flail delivers up to 40% more force than a comparable rigid weapon. Combine this with armor-piercing spikes and the results devastating damage to even the best-protected adversaries. Medieval knights learned firsthand that momentum wasn't merely a physics term, it was what turned their armor into a colander. The flail existed in numerous variations. The most common was the single-headed military flail with a spiked iron ball, but historical texts and artwork depict more elaborate versions, some with multiple chains and striking heads, increasing the weapon's already chaotic unpredictability. A particularly fearsome variant from Eastern Europe incorporated small hollow chambers within the striking heads that created a terrifying whistling sound during use. This auditory weapon added psychological terror, disorienting opponents before impact. It was medieval psychological warfare. The flail's reputation necessitated specialized countermeasures. Knights trained to anticipate the striking head's arc and perfectly time their movements to evade its lethal reach. This training underscores the serious threat posed by the flail on medieval battlefields. Although less common than swords or spears, the flail held a unique place in a knight's nightmares, a weapon whose erratic trajectory defied straightforward countermeasures. The flail's notoriety even extended beyond the battlefield. In many European regions, its agricultural origins associated it with peasant uprisings. The military flail's design stemmed from the grain flail, a farming implement used for threshing grain. And during times of rebellion, peasants would adapt these commonplace tools into effective weapons. These improvised weapons proved surprisingly effective against armored opponents, contributing significantly to the success of several peasant revolts. The Hussite rebels of 15th century Bohemia were especially known for their effective use of flails against heavily armored foes. The weapon's unpredictable trajectory made defensive maneuvers difficult to time precisely, even for seasoned knights. This brief moment of hesitation could prove fatal in the heat of battle, where split-second decisions determined life or death. The flail introduced an element of existential crisis to combat. While the warhammer delivered direct, crushing force, the flail introduced an element of chaos that even the best-protected knight had reason to fear. However, despite its unpredictability, the flail still demanded a skilled warrior to wield it effectively. Other weapons emerged that emphasized lethality with simpler designs. The godendag, meaning good day in Flemish, stands as one of history's most effective examples of uncomplicated weapon design. This seemingly rudimentary weapon fundamentally altered the course of medieval warfare by placing considerable power into the hands of ordinary soldiers. At first glance, the godendag appears almost primitive, a sturdy wooden club with a single, protruding metal spike. However, this deceptively simple design concealed tactical versatility that proved devastating even against the most heavily armored opponents. The godendag's effectiveness stemmed from its dual-purpose nature. The spike could pierce armor or dislodge mounted knights. The heavy club end could deliver crushing blows to those who had been unseated. This dual functionality made it the ideal weapon for foot soldiers confronting armored cavalry, a common scenario in medieval warfare. The godendag's defining moment came at the Battle of Courtrai in 1302, also known as the Battle of the Golden Spurs on July 11th. An army of Flemish citizens and peasants confronted the French knights, the most elite heavy cavalry in Europe. The French were so confident of victory that they brought along a wagon filled with ropes for binding their expected prisoners. The ensuing events astounded the medieval world. The Flemish militia, primarily armed with godendags, decisively defeated the French knights, scattering the battlefield with golden spurs, symbols of knighthood, to such an extent that the conflict earned its alternative name. Surviving godendags demonstrate remarkable diversity in size and design. Some possess shorter handles ideal for close-quarters combat within formations, while others extended to nearly 6 feet in length for frontline troops. Spikes also varied, short and pyramidal or long and slender, depending on their intended use against various armor types. Despite its apparent simplicity, the Godendag underwent constant refinement based on battlefield experience. For centuries, knights had cultivated an image of martial superiority, with complex codes of combat and expensive equipment, creating barriers to entry for common soldiers. The Godendag shattered this illusion, proving that a simple weapon, wielded skillfully, could overcome aristocratic advantages. After Courtrai, chronicles reveal a noticeable shift in noble attitudes towards infantry, a newfound respect tempered by fear. The Godendag's production required minimal resources and expertise. A village blacksmith could fashion the spike, and any skilled woodworker could create the club. This accessibility allowed communities to arm themselves rapidly during conflicts. During the Flemish Revolt against French rule, towns could equip hundreds of militia members with Godendags in a matter of weeks. The Godendag's legacy extends well beyond the medieval era. The concept of combining piercing and crushing elements in a single infantry weapon profoundly influenced polearm design for centuries. Later weapons, such as the halberd and the poleaxe, incorporated similar principles, albeit with more elaborate construction. Even with the emergence of these sophisticated designs, the Godendag remained in use among militia forces well into the 16th century, a testament to its enduring effectiveness. The rise of firearms ultimately rendered most medieval melee weapons obsolete, including the Godendag. Yet this simple weapon had already transformed warfare by demonstrating that technological superiority didn't always necessitate complexity or expense. Sometimes the most revolutionary tools are also the most straightforward, a lesson that military innovators continue to rediscover. While the Godendag empowered common soldiers through its simplicity, other medieval weapons embodied the opposite approach: extravagant excess. The Zweihander, a massive two-handed sword, dominated battlefields through sheer imposing presence and devastating power. If the warhammer was medieval problem-solving through brute force, and the flail was medieval chaos theory in action, then the Zweihander was medieval overcompensation in weapon form. Zweihander, German for two-hander, was a straightforward name for a weapon that was anything but simple. These enormous swords measured between 5 and 6 feet long, with some exceeding 7 feet. The blade itself could be over 4 feet long, with a grip long enough for a two-handed hold. These weren't merely large swords, they were portable siege weapons disguised as blades. When your sword is taller than most of the people you're fighting, you're making a statement and possibly compensating for something. A typical Zweihander weighed between 7 and 14 pounds, with most battlefield examples falling towards the lighter end of the spectrum. This might not sound particularly heavy until one considers the sheer exhaustion of repeatedly swinging such a weapon in combat. Modern martial arts tests with authentic Zweihanders demonstrate that even highly trained athletes struggle to maintain effective fighting form for more than a few minutes. The physical demands on historical users must have been extraordinary. They didn't need two hands because the manual stated so. They needed them to avoid dropping the weapon after the third swing. German mercenaries known as Landsknechts specialized in wielding these massive weapons. These professional soldiers, emerging in the late 15th century, quickly established a reputation as some of Europe's most formidable fighters. Within Landsknecht formations, Zweihander wielders received double pay due to the weapons demanding skill and strength requirements, earning them the title Doppelsöldner, double pay men. This financial incentive attracted the largest and strongest recruits. Primary sources detail these sword wielders' specialized battlefield roles. Rather than fighting in conventional formations, Zweihander users often served as formation breakers, charging directly into opposing pike squares to disrupt their cohesion. The Zweihander's long reach allowed its user to sever multiple pike shafts with a single powerful swing, creating gaps exploitable by following troops. Pike formations, once considered impenetrable, now faced a formidable counter. Imagine the terror of witnessing someone charging your seemingly invincible formation with what amounted to a 6-foot razor blade. It was like bringing a metal tree to a stick fight. The Zweihander design evolved throughout its service life. Early versions resembled oversized longswords, but later models incorporated features enhancing battlefield effectiveness. Most notably, a ricasso, an unsharpened section of the blade just above the crossguard, often wrapped in leather, provided an additional gripping surface. This allowed for better control, with the wielder placing one hand on the grip and the other on the ricasso for leverage during close combat. Many Zweihanders also featured parrying hooks or flukes projecting from the blade near the cross guard. These secondary guards protected the user's hands, provided additional leverage for controlling an opponent's weapon, and could trap and disarm enemies. The sword transformed from a purely cutting implement into a versatile battlefield tool, capable of slashing, thrusting, hooking, and trapping enemy weapons. The medieval Swiss Army knife, if that knife were 6 feet long and required Olympic-level strength to lift. One military observer noted how enemy formations would visibly recoil at the approach of Landsknechts, wielding these enormous swords. The Zweihander's distinctive profile, particularly when carried upright with the blade resting on the shoulder, created an image of superhuman warriors, demoralizing opponents before battle even commenced. Half the battle was psychological. Witnessing someone casually carrying what resembled an entire blacksmith shop on their shoulder might encourage an opponent to reconsider their approach. Training with the Zweihander demanded specialized techniques, differing from those employed with smaller swords. Surviving combat manuals illustrate unique stances and movements designed to manage the weapon's momentum rather than fight against it. Users learn to transition smoothly from one strike to the next, maintaining constant motion to avoid becoming vulnerable. A properly trained Zweihander wielder moved with a dancer's grace, the unwieldy blade becoming an extension of their body. Medieval Zweihander training manuals likely began with an important disclaimer: results may vary based on how many times you've skipped arm day. At the Battle of Bicaka, 1522, Landsknechts armed with Zweihanders cut through dense Swiss pike formations previously deemed unbreakable. The psychological shock of witnessing their invincible formations devastated by these enormous swords contributed to a significant Swiss defeat and marked a turning point in infantry tactics. The Swiss pikemen learned a harsh lesson that day. When the enemy brings a sword requiring its own zip code, your unbreakable formation is about to undergo some unplanned renovations. Despite their effectiveness, Zweihanders remained specialized weapons, not standard issue. Extensive training, physical demands, and material costs limited their use to elite troops. A quality Zweihander demanded significant amounts of high-grade steel and the skills of a master swordsmith, making them expensive investments even for well-funded mercenary companies. When your weapon costs as much as a small house and requires the musculature of a professional athlete, mass production is impractical. These massive swords remained in active military use longer than expected, with documented battlefield deployments continuing into the early 17th century, well into the age of firearms. This longevity speaks to their effectiveness. The Zweihander found particular use in defending narrow passages like breaches in city walls, where its long reach and devastating cutting power could hold back multiple attackers. Nothing said this doorway's closed quite like a man with a sword the size of a small tree standing in their breach. Surviving examples are testaments to both their intimidating size and remarkable craftsmanship, often featuring elaborate etching, gilded inscriptions, and intricate hilts reflecting the prestige associated with these weapons. The classic Zweihander silhouette became a status symbol for mercenary companies, with ornately decorated examples serving as parade weapons and symbols of unit pride. Some were likely admired more than used in battle, the medieval equivalent of a sports car that never leaves the garage. While the Zweihander represented peak offensive capability through sheer size and reach, medieval weapon designers also created tools for more specific battlefield objectives. Medieval combat wasn't always about killing. Capturing an opponent alive often yielded greater rewards than another body count. Enter the man-catcher, a weapon designed not to end lives but to ensure prisoners remained alive and compliant. Because sometimes killing your enemies wasn't enough, you also needed to invoice them later. The economics of medieval warfare made the man-catcher extremely practical. Knights and nobles represented significant financial investments, both in their equipment and potential ransom value. A dead knight yielded only his armor and weapons. A captured knight, however, could bring a fortune in ransom money. Historical records reveal astronomical ransom sums, with some high-ranking nobles commanding payments equivalent to several years of a town's tax revenue. One valuable French noble captured during the 100 Years' War was ransomed for the modern equivalent of $6 million. Medieval accountants had discovered a crucial principle. Dead knights were a one-time transaction. Live ones generated a steady income stream. Wielding a man-catcher required less brute strength than a warhammer or Zweihander, but demanded precise timing and positioning. Users were trained to target mounted opponents, utilizing the pole's length to snare a knight's neck or limb, then twist to unseat him. Once on the ground, a heavily armored knight became surprisingly vulnerable, weighed down by his own protection. The irony wasn't lost on medieval soldiers. Nothing conveyed the message, "Your protection has become your prison," quite like witnessing a nobleman struggling helplessly within his custom-fitted metal cage. The man-catcher proved particularly effective against helmets that protected the face but limited peripheral vision, allowing man-catcher wielders to approach from blind spots. Despite the elaborate engineering of medieval headgear, someone forgot the simple "check your blind spots" feature. Regional variations reflected different tactical needs. Germanic versions featured longer poles for safely reaching mounted opponents. Mediterranean variants incorporated sophisticated trapping mechanisms, including spring-loaded components. Some advanced designs included secondary mechanisms to tighten the collar further after initial capture, ensuring that struggling only increased the prisoner's discomfort. Medieval weaponsmiths had essentially invented the "quit struggling or it gets worse" principle long before modern restraint technology. Man-catcher use demanded teamwork. Military manuscripts describe formations of 3 to 5 soldiers working together to capture high-value targets. One soldier wielded the man-catcher, while others provided protection and secured the prisoner. These capture teams were highly valued, receiving bonus pay for successfully taking important enemies alive. They were the medieval equivalent of repo men, except instead of seizing carts for missed payments, they seized enemy combatants for missed battlefield victories. The man-catcher found particular utility in urban settings and riot control. City watch units from Venice to London used man-catchers to apprehend criminals in crowded streets. Their ability to subdue opponents without necessarily killing them made them ideal in situations where indiscriminate violence could spark wider unrest. Nobles seeking to avoid capture developed countermeasures. Some knightly orders modified their armor with reinforced collars to prevent the man-catcher from securing a grip around the neck. Others trained specifically to identify and neutralize man-catcher wielders, targeting them as high-priority threats. Nothing incentivized innovation quite like the prospect of being paraded home in a neck collar while your family sold a summer castle to pay your ransom. Unlike many medieval weapons rendered obsolete by firearms, the man-catcher retained practical utility even as battlefield technology evolved. Its ability to control opponents at a distance without killing fulfilled a need that guns could not. Modified versions appeared in law enforcement contexts well into the 19th century, especially in areas where subduing suspects without firearms was a priority. Shifting from the controlled restraint of the man-catcher, we encounter a medieval weapon where mercy was never a design consideration. The Morning Star embodies medieval brutality in its purest form. A heavy metal ball studded with spikes designed to inflict catastrophic damage with every strike. If nightmares could be forged in iron, they would look exactly like this. The name Morning Star derives from its visual resemblance to the planet Venus, the bright morning star. The poetic name starkly contrasts with its brutal battlefield function. Medieval warriors had a knack for bestowing beautiful names upon terrifying weapons. This particular star granted no wishes. It ensured enemies wouldn't be making any more of their own. Unlike the flail, the Morning Star lacked a chain connecting the striking head to the handle. This direct attachment enhanced its reliability and control in the chaos of combat, transforming a potential nightmare into a precision-guided instrument of destruction. A typical Morning Star consisted of 3 main components: a wooden shaft, a metal mounting system, and the spike-striking head. This head ranged in size from a relatively modest 3-inch diameter with half-inch spikes to massive versions spanning 6 inches across, with spikes extending 2 to 3 inches. The largest Morning Stars recovered from European battlefields weigh over 10 pounds, sufficient mass to fracture bone even without the added trauma of the spikes. With such a weapon, essentially a medieval porcupine on a stick, subtlety was never a design priority. The Morning Star's physics made it devastatingly effective against armored opponents. The weapon concentrated tremendous force onto the small contact points of each spike tip. When impacting plate armor, these spikes could penetrate metal that would have deflected swords or even direct warhammer blows. The resulting wounds were notoriously difficult to treat with medieval medical practices. leading to high mortality rates even among knights who survived the initial engagement. This spike nightmare didn't just inflict injury, it ensured medieval surgeons also suffered nightmares trying to treat the injuries. Archaeological evidence reveals the Morningstar's grim efficiency. Skeletal remains from medieval battlefields display distinctive trauma patterns associated with this weapon. Clustered puncture wounds accompanied by extensive underlying bone fractures. Medieval battlefield injuries were often identifiable by weapon type. Morningstar victims are perhaps the only soldiers in history who died from an acute case of too many holes. The Morningstar didn't just kill, it left an easily identifiable calling card for archaeologists centuries later. The Morningstar demanded less technical skill than weapons like swords or flails, but it required substantial upper body strength. Military training manuals from the period recommend specific exercises to develop the necessary shoulder and arm strength, including practice swings with progressively heavier training versions. Once mastered, however, the Morningstar delivered devastating results, particularly against heavily armored foes. The Morningstar was the medieval equivalent of a gym membership one actually uses, except the results weren't impressive biceps, but impressive body counts. Tactical applications varied depending on the military context. Mounted knights favored shorter-handled versions that could be used effectively from horseback, delivering powerful overhead blows amplified by the rider's height and the horse's momentum. Infantry formations typically utilize longer-shafted versions, swung in wide arcs to clear space around the wielder, or thrust forward like improvised spears. This versatility made the Morningstar a highly adaptable weapon, capable of wreaking havoc from various positions and ranges. The psychological impact of facing Morningstar-wielding troops should not be underestimated. The weapon's distinctive appearance, a spiked metal ball, instinctively triggered primal fears, even in hardened warriors. This psychological effect became a tactical advantage. Some commanders positioned Morningstar wielders at the forefront of their formations to demoralize opponents before contact was even made. The sight of soldiers bearing what resembled medieval torture devices with handles was enough to make many reconsider their battle plans. Variations of the Morningstar appeared across Europe and Asia, reflecting local military traditions and manufacturing capabilities. Religious imagery occasionally incorporated the Morningstar in unexpected ways. Medieval artwork sometimes depicts angels wielding Morningstars against demons, suggesting that even divine retribution might require spiked implements. This association led to an alternate name in some regions: holy water sprinkler, a grimly humorous reference to the blood spray produced when the weapon found its mark. Medieval humor often leaned towards the macabre. There's a little subtler than a face full of metal spikes. The Morningstar's legacy extends beyond its battlefield use. Its distinctive silhouette became a visual shorthand for brutality in medieval artwork, appearing in depictions of hell and divine punishment. This association was so strong that Morningstars were sometimes mounted above city gates or government buildings as warnings against lawbreaking, serving as three-dimensional symbols of the authorities' power to inflict punishment. While other medieval weapons might fade from memory, this spiked nightmare continues to haunt our collective imagination as the quintessential symbol of medieval brutality. While the Morningstar represented direct, unambiguous violence, medieval weapon designers also created more specialized tools. The bec de corbin, raven's beak in French, exemplifies a more considered approach to defeating armored opponents. Its name perfectly captures its most distinctive feature: a wickedly curved spike resembling a bird's beak, designed specifically to pierce plate armor with terrifying efficiency. The bec de corbin belongs to the family of polearms, weapons mounted on long wooden shafts for extended reach and leverage. What sets this polearm apart is its versatile head, incorporating multiple weapon types into a single, lethal package. One side features the namesake spike, or beak, curved downwards and tapering to a sharp point. The opposite side typically has a hammerhead for delivering crushing blows. Many versions also include a straight spike extending from the top for thrusting attacks. This three-in-one design made the bec de corbin the medieval equivalent of a Swiss Army knife, though its functions were limited to various methods of inflicting grievous harm. A knight carrying one never had to worry about bringing the wrong tool for the job. It was the ultimate battlefield multi-tool, posing the question, How would you prefer your armor penetrated today? Pierced, crushed, or skewered? A skilled wielder could seamlessly transition between piercing, crushing, and thrusting attacks without changing weapons, adapting to different armor types and combat scenarios with remarkable flexibility. Medieval combat manuals detail specific techniques for each attack form, suggesting extensive training to fully utilize the weapon's versatility. The bec de corbin's effectiveness derived from simple mechanical advantage. The long wooden shaft, typically 5 to 7 feet, acted as a lever multiplying the wielder's striking force. When this amplified force was concentrated onto the beak's or top spike's minuscule contact point, the resulting pressure could exceed 4,000 newtons per square inch, more than enough to pierce even the finest plate armor. For context, modern ballistic tests show that most medieval plate armor could withstand pressures of around 2,000 newtons per square inch before failing. The distinctive sound of a bec de corbin piercing plate armor, a high-pitched screech followed by a dull thud, was noted by military chroniclers as a particularly ominous sign for the recipient. Hearing that noise meant someone had just received a special delivery, courtesy of the Ravensbeak Postal Service. No signature required, delivery confirmed. Training with the bec de corbin required greater technical skill than many other medieval weapons. Its weight distribution made it challenging for novices, demanding months of practice to master. Military treatises recommend progressive training regimens, starting with basic strikes against stationary targets and advancing to complex combination attacks against moving opponents. Knights who mastered these techniques became particularly feared on the battlefield, capable of defeating heavily armored opponents who would have been nearly invulnerable to conventional weapons. The bec de corbin was particularly favored by foot soldiers fighting mounted knights. The weapon's length allowed infantry to strike riders from a relatively safe distance, while the specialized head design could either unseat the knight or deliver fatal blows through armor. Military records from several major late medieval battles credit infantry, armed with these weapons, for overcoming previously dominant heavy cavalry forces. The Battle of Courtrai, 1302, for instance, saw Flemish infantry armed with similar polearms defeat elite French heavy cavalry. Manufacturing a high-quality bec de corbin necessitated collaboration between specialized craftsmen. Blacksmiths forged the complex head, carefully hardening the striking surfaces while maintaining sufficient flexibility in the socket to prevent breakage. Woodworkers selected ash or oak shafts, paying close attention to the grain pattern to ensure the pole could withstand combat stresses. The joining of head to shaft was critical. High-quality examples featured reinforced sockets and additional strapping to prevent separation during use. The distinctive silhouette, especially the curved beak, projected an ominous impression even before combat commenced. Regional variations of the bec de corbin reflected differing military traditions and tactical needs. Italian versions featured longer, slender beaks optimized for penetrating the high-quality plate armor produced in Milan. French designs often incorporated broader hammer faces, creating a balance between piercing and crushing capabilities. Eastern European variants sometimes included additional hooks or tines, allowing the weapon to disarm opponents or pull riders from their horses. The weapon remained in active military service for a remarkably long period, with documented battlefield deployments spanning from the late 13th to the early 16th centuries, demonstrating its consistent effectiveness against armored adversaries even as armor design constantly evolved. The ongoing arms race between armor and anti-armor weapons drove innovation on both sides. Each new defensive improvement prompted corresponding offensive adjustments. The bec de corbin's legacy extends beyond its battlefield application. Its distinctive head design influenced later polearm development, with elements appearing in weapons used well into the firearm era. Modern tactical entry tools used by law enforcement and military forces incorporate similar design principles, particularly in breaching tools that combine piercing, prying, and striking functions into a single implement. The fundamental concept of versatile weapon head mounted on a leverage-enhancing shaft proved so effective that its core principles remain relevant in specialized equipment today. While the bec de corbin represents the pinnacle of hand-to-hand anti-armor technology, medieval military engineers were concurrently developing weapons capable of delivering death from considerably greater distances. The ballista marked humanity's first serious attempt to address warfare's oldest problem: how to kill inconveniently distant people. While the bec de corbin allowed warriors to engage armored opponents at close range, the ballista extended that reach to hundreds of yards. This massive weapon, in essence, scaled up the humble crossbow to terrifying proportions, creating a siege engine capable of penetrating multiple layers of armored soldiers with a single shot. At its core, the ballista operated on a simple principle: storing energy in twisted sinew or rope, and then releasing it explosively to propel a large projectile. The resulting weapon could launch bolts weighing up to 26 pounds at speeds approaching 100 miles per hour. These projectiles carried sufficient momentum to pierce shields, armor, and multiple bodies with a single shot. Unlike arrows, which descend in predictable arcs, ballista bolts traveled in relatively flat trajectories at speeds too fast for the human eye to easily track. Soldiers described the terrifying experience of watching comrades suddenly impaled by massive bolts that seemed to appear without warning. This invisible death from afar created unique battlefield anxieties. One might survive a sword fight through skill, but avoiding a ballista bolt was purely a matter of chance. Medieval troops referred to this as God's dice, though the deity they invoked was likely not the one they worshipped on Sundays. Operating a ballista required specialized training and usually a crew of at least 3 to 5 soldiers. One soldier aimed the weapon, while others managed the winding mechanism that tensed the sinew. A well-trained crew could achieve firing rates of 2 or 3 shots per minute. Not rapid fire by modern standards, but sufficient to wreak havoc in densely packed formations. These crews developed specialized vocabulary and techniques, becoming highly valued specialists within medieval armies. Their status reflected a harsh battlefield reality. A single, well-placed ballista bolt could inflict more casualties than dozens of conventional fighters. Ballista size varied throughout the medieval period, ranging from cart-mounted versions requiring only 2 crew members to massive, fixed emplacements demanding teams of 8 or more. The largest documented ballistae could launch projectiles weighing over 100 pounds, though these behemoths typically fired stones rather than bolts and functioned more like artillery than oversized crossbows. These larger variants remained in active military use well into the early firearm era, proving effective long after other medieval weapons had become obsolete. The ballista represented an early form of force multiplication, enabling a small number of soldiers to project lethal force far beyond their individual capabilities. While impressive in range and penetration, the ballista primarily targeted individual soldiers or small groups. Medieval military engineers, however, were already developing long-range weapons of even greater destructive potential. The Scorpion, a name that accurately reflects its characteristics, was swift, deadly, and possessed a sting one never saw coming. While the ballista excelled at penetrating multiple targets with massive bolts, the Scorpion prioritized speed and accuracy over sheer power. This lighter, more mobile torsion weapon could be rapidly repositioned on the battlefield, enabling medieval armies to swiftly respond to evolving threats with precisely targeted death from distances that seemed almost magical to medieval soldiers. Originally developed by Roman engineers, the Scorpion disappeared during the early medieval period, only to be rediscovered and improved upon during the Crusades. The weapon's key innovation was its dual torsion bundles, twisted sinew or human hair, that stored immense energy. When released, these bundles propelled a dart-like projectile with the force to penetrate shields and armor at ranges exceeding 400 yards. Medieval armies essentially rediscovered that most military problems could be solved by finding new ways to hurl pointy objects at enemies very, very fast. The Scorpion excelled at ensuring that those pointy objects reached the precisely intended individual at precisely the wrong moment. A well-trained Scorpion team could achieve remarkable firing rates, up to 10 bolts per minute, in the hands of elite operators. This combination of rate of fire, accuracy, and penetrating power made the Scorpion disproportionately influential on the battlefield. Military historians estimate that during the Siege of Acre, 1191, fewer than 30 Scorpion teams accounted for over 800 casualties among the defenders. Morning roll call for the defenders became less a matter of who was present and more a question of who hadn't been ventilated during the night. The psychological impact transcended the physical casualties. Defenders forced to man walls under Scorpion fire suffered severely depleted morale. The knowledge that an unseen projectile could end one's life at any moment created what medieval chronicles described as the waiting death, a paralyzing anxiety that undermined defensive efforts more effectively than direct assaults. This psychological warfare aspect made the Scorpion a valuable siege weapon, even when its physical damage to structures remained relatively limited. Some besieged cities even reported cases of scorpion fever, a nervous condition characterized by constant flinching and ducking at shadows and sounds. While the Scorpion delivered precise death from unprecedented distances, medieval military engineers were simultaneously developing weapons of truly massive, destructive potential. If medieval siege weaponry had a royal family, the trebuchet would undoubtedly occupy the throne. This colossal engine of destruction represented the absolute zenith of pre-gunpowder artillery, capable of hurling projectiles weighing hundreds of pounds over incredible distances with devastating effect. Where the Scorpion killed with precision, the trebuchet killed with overwhelming, raw force. The trebuchet operated on a counterweight system that would impress any physics instructor. A massive weight, often exceeding 7,000 pounds, hung from the short end of a long wooden arm. When this weight was released, it propelled the longer end of the arm upwards at tremendous speed, launching whatever projectile happened to be loaded into its sling. This seemingly simple mechanism could propel a 200-pound stone over 300 meters with sufficient force to pulverize castle walls upon impact. Castle architects who believed they had constructed impenetrable fortifications will learn the hard way that their supposedly unbreakable walls were merely not yet broken. The trebuchet had a way of transforming even the most confident castle defender into an anxious homeseeker. Medieval engineering reached its peak in these massive weapons. The largest documented trebuchets required crews of up to 60 men to operate and could launch projectiles weighing over 300 pounds. Contemporary accounts describe the earth-shattering impact of these massive stones, with one chronicler remarking that a direct hit on a tower reduced it to dust and splinters, as if it had never existed. Castle dwellers learned to dread the distinctive creaking sound of a trebuchet being winched back, the medieval equivalent of hearing a demolition crew setting up shop directly above your home. Trebuchet ammunition showcased medieval creativity at its most disturbingly innovative. While stones remained the standard projectile, besieging armies often employed creative and psychologically impactful alternatives. Historical records document trebuchets launching diseased animal carcasses, severed human heads, and even live prisoners into besieged cities. One particularly notorious incident during the Siege of Kaffa, 1347, involved catapulting plague victims over the walls. The exceptional range and power of trebuchets transformed siege warfare. Before the trebuchet, defenders behind strong walls could reasonably expect to outlast most sieges. After its introduction, no wall was truly safe, and no fortress was truly secure. This psychological advantage often proved as valuable as the physical damage inflicted. Many cities surrendered at the mere sight of trebuchets being assembled outside their walls. Witnessing your enemy constructing what resembled an enormous wooden middle finger pointed directly at your fortifications was typically a strong incentive to reconsider one's strategic choices. These 10 weapons, representing the zenith of medieval military technology, also revealed the enduring expression of human ingenuity, even within the grim context of warfare. From simple spiked clubs to colossal engines of destruction, their evolution tells a story of innovation driven by one of humanity's oldest and most enduring pursuits.